Good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, and welcome to another Security Boulevard webinar. Glad you can join us, and hopefully we're going to have a great webinar for you today. Today's webinar is Successful DevSecOps, and it's brought to us by our friends at CA Vericode, who, for my money, probably one of the leaders in the DevSecOps space. So it should be a great one. Before we get started with our panel, for those of you who have been on our webinars, whether it be Security Boulevard or DevOps.com, just quickly, we use the GoToWebinar control panel, or the GoToWebinar webinar system, and we have a set-aside time for questions. If you look at your control panel, you should see a section marked questions, and if you hit the little arrow or caret so it faces down and that section expands, you will see a question section. And if you would like, we'd like you to type your questions in real time. Don't wait for the end of the webinar. Don't wait till the question section. If you're like me, you're liable to forget it. But put them in there, and we will do our best to get to every question. The nice thing about putting them in there is also we do maintain a record of it. So if we can't get to your question live online on the webinar today, we can get to you via email, or somehow we'll post the answers on securityboulevard.com. So please ask your questions in real time. Don't be shy. The more questions, the merrier. It makes for a better webinar experience. I personally find them much more interactive that way. Secondly, if you have a technical issue, maybe my audio is not coming across, it's been known to happen, or the slides aren't progressing or something like that, we do have folks standing by in our chat room, which is down at the bottom. And if you put your issues in there, our webinar engineers will do their best to try to help you with that and get it straight. So please, we want you to enjoy the experience. And if you have any questions, let us know. All right. As I said earlier, today's webinar is Successful DevSecOps, and we're lucky to be joined by Christian Rio. I probably messed that up. It's Ryu. Christian Ryu, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. I try my best. Christian, welcome to Security Boulevard webinars.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan.
All right.
All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Today, I'd like to share with you my thoughts on DevSecOps and what makes for successful adoption of DevSecOps by organizations, large ones and small ones. Before we get to any recommendations, though, I'd kind of like to quickly cover the most important pressing question that is likely on all of your minds when you hear the word DevSecOps, which is, what is DevSecOps really? There is a lot of talk about this, and there's a lot of websites devoted to it, and seminars and webinars, and a whole lot of anecdotal evidence of people implementing DevSecOps. But more than anything else, there is a lot of confusion around it. People often say DevSecOps, but don't really know what it means. They haven't really seen it working in an organization. They've, heard bits and pieces and heard good stories or, about it. Many times developers, the dev in DevSecOps, will see this as something prestigious to tack onto their job title more than anything else. So you'll go to a conference and you'll see a lot of badges that say DevSecOps or DevOps on them. But mostly, people are taking on these job titles without necessarily taking on the appropriate responsibilities, really understanding them. Operations people see DevSecOps as a way of getting to wear the pager a little bit less and write some code too, so they're naturally attracted to it, possibly for all the wrong reasons, though. And security people often see DevSecOps as a way to be finally included in the development process and less of an afterthought. Security is often, something that is an afterthought to, the DevOps process and is kind of coming in late in the game. So to increase their visibility, security people are kind of pushing the whole DevSecOps thing. So yeah, there's a lot of manifestos about it, and not a lot of great examples that could be used, for you to follow. But most importantly, though, it's a transition to a different process for all of those people, and it takes some time. And we need better examples of what works and what doesn't work for that transition. So let's just go to some canonical examples here. What people are saying versus what people are doing. Sans has this to say about it. DevSecOps strives to automate core security tasks by embedding security controls and processes into the DevOps workflow. And DevSecOps.org says that the purpose and intent of DevSecOps is to build on the mindset that everyone is responsible for security, with the goal of safely distributing security decisions at speed and scale to those who hold the highest level of context without sacrificing the safety required. So the common themes here are automation and shared responsibility. Automation is a bit of a process shift, but it is reasonably well understood. Less well understood is that the shared responsibility part is a cultural shift. And with that comes the issues of personality and expectation setting. Security needs to be accepted as part of the DevOps culture for DevSecOps to work. So wherever you stand today, the question is, how do you get to DevSecOps? So you could start from scratch if you were a new department or a business unit or a startup that is brand new and you don't have any organizational or process baggage. You probably could just hop right into this. Without having to do a whole lot of transition work. It's probable, though, that if you're one of those startups or a new business unit, that you have a lot of other things going on as well, and that's pretty easy to lose sight of DevSecOps goals. So when you're building a new development organization, there's a lot of things to do, and it's easy to forget about DevSecOps as a process. If you're a larger organization coming to this, you probably have a centralized application security team with some AppSec managers in charge of application security for the company. You probably have a CISO, and security has showed up as conversation at board meetings and at higher level responsibilities. So coming to DevSecOps in that kind of an organization looks a little differently when there's already an extant organization devoted to security that might have already burnt some bridges with development. The relationship between the DevOps effort, which is to move quickly, can be a little at odds with the security effort sometimes. So you may have some cultural repair that needs to happen. It does happen. So if you're a smaller organization, though, you probably have a flatter structure and some maybe development pods where you could easily add security responsibilities to development teams. But the question begins, how do you scale? How do you scale that as things grow? Security knowledge tends to cluster in groups like AppSec, AppSec groups because or AppSec teams, because the security knowledge is not evenly distributed in an organization. So how do you ensure that your teams will get access to the security skill set that they need as necessary? That's the real challenge for the smaller organizations. So first we'll look at the big company case, and then we'll look at the small company case. If you have a centralized AppSec team, your goal really needs to be to integrate that AppSec team across the entire pipeline, not just at a single point. It's fine to start with a CI/CD pipeline as a place to put security scans, and that's pretty typical as people start to approach. They just kind of stick sec right in the middle of Dev and Ops, literally by putting some scans in the CI/CD pipeline, but it doesn't really stop there. The AppSec team needs to be doing more than just putting scanners in a pipeline. You need to be integrated across the entire pipeline, which means security needs to be able to work with developers to make sure that security's input to them is both timely and respectful of the developer's time. Chances are this is already a sticking point in your organization. Developers need to filter out a lot of noise to do their jobs. And security needs to look a lot more like signal than like noise. So don't recommend high false positive tools to developers. They hate that. They hate wasting their time. They want to review security issues. They feel usually a sense of responsibility to do that, but they become, tired of fixing things that they don't believe are real. If you have thorough coverage but high false positive tools, you might want to save those for later in the pipeline. Pick tools for developers that let them focus on specific areas of their code that they care about and get them the most relevant flaw information. And that means, yes, different tools for different people at different times. Not all tools are built the same, and some are built with developers in mind, while others are more intended as checkpoints for when responsibility is handed off or when things go to production. For this centralized AppSec team to be sort of accepted across an organization, you really have to consider structure. Structure really matters here. The cultural shift to DevSecOps often means breaking down ivory towers that have been carefully built. If your developers, if you want them to care about security, security experts need to socialize with the developers and share their ideals. The goal is really to ensure that developers gain a sense of personal responsibility for security and that it's not just somebody else's problem. Many times in the smaller organizations or with less experienced developers, you'll find that security is more likely to be adopted by developers because the people with the most experience that should know better are usually the ones that need the most coaching. People do get set in their ways. So bear that in mind when addressing the cultural aspects of integrating security. So do your audits, your security audits with your developers. Don't just send them a report. You might do things like readout calls, things like that with customers. Do them internally, and have security people have meetings with developers to go over the results of a report instead of just throwing security analysis over the wall as a report. Have the security people around and available to interpret those results. Otherwise, you run the risk of developers, becoming desensitized and looking at the security analysis and just throwing it on the floor as a false positive when they could be legitimate issues. Security should have an opportunity to explain why certain flaws need to be fixed, and to build a consensus that can be reached so you can prioritize appropriately. So for smaller organizations, the cultural problems are usually less of an issue, but process issues tend to dominate. So to jumpstart DevSecOps for those teams, you'll want to give those teams complete control over their services or their product. This means making them responsible for uptime and reliability. It's not just ops problem anymore. It's got to be the whole team's problem. They need to adopt, as a team, a service level agreement and agree to be bound to it. Developers who want to enjoy the freedom and flexibility to push their code to production more frequently, this means that that the normal operations SLA that they adhere to needs to include a time frame to fix security issues. The classical notion of QA being responsible for making sure security issues don't make it out the door doesn't really apply here, and it hasn't really worked that well in general. Security response needs to be factored in, and developers need to be ready to fix issues that escape to production. This might mean that devs get to wear a pager. Sorry, devs. It is a trade-off for being able to move quickly, though. You have to be willing to respond as well. So another issue with these teams is that I mentioned earlier that security skill set is not often distributed evenly. So sometimes people naturally end up, through just the course of their normal work, being more responsible for security than other people. This is just a problem that can't necessarily be avoided. You can try security education and you can socialize security as much as you want, but there are going to be people that are more aware of it than others. So you can address this somewhat through better automation, but you might not want to fight this fight at all. Turns out that meeting SLA might be just a job unto itself. And that with a security skill set in short supply, finding the right person to help bridge the gap might be easier than educating everyone on the team at the same time. You have to start somewhere. So there is a new role out there that you might have seen called a site or service reliability engineer. This job, or the goal of this job, is really to formalize the role responsible for meeting SLA, basically meeting SLA at all costs. It was first implemented and described by a guy named Ben Traynor at Google. And internally, they have teams of these site reliability engineers. Their role is 50-50 dev and ops and includes security as a responsibility. So that basically it is the DevSecOps role in a nutshell. Given to one team, one job. They're often embedded in specific teams or shared resource between teams. So sometimes in larger organizations, they're also horizontal and have specific skill sets. So specializing in specific application tiers like databases or front end. So to build an SRE organization, many times you'll laterally promote people from the AppSec team, development team, and operations teams based on their ability to work together and their knowledge of security, and get them to operate under a new SRE charter that gives them the autonomy to move between teams and help them grow closer together toward a common goal of the service level agreement. So we could talk about that more if you'd like, but the question now is, what does DevSecOps look like when it's done well? What should these SREs or otherwise DevSecOps-enabled teams be doing, and what goals should they have? Your first goal really is to measure absolutely everything. You want a DevSecOps dashboard. You need to have one place to go. That's a nexus for all system status. You want to see service error rates, web page and database query response times, patch levels, and alarms on anything suspicious, scanning results, measurement on issue resolution times, and even customer support response times too. So to do this, if your devs and SREs are savvy and motivated, they could roll their own dashboards with like Kibana or Grafana. There are, if they want to write code and really get into it and own the process, there's lots of great manual dashboard constructions tools for Ruby and Python and JavaScript. But if you want most of it done for you, just to get started quickly, there's a great system out there called Hygia, and I'll spell that. It's Hygiea. It's an open source, ready-to-go DevOps dashboard that was built by the people at Capital One, and that basically is just drop it in and start plugging in all of your sensors, and you can get started really quickly with measurement. So yeah, the next thing that you need to do is start plugging the right things into that dashboard. So to do that, your vendor tools should be the ones that support exporting data. Many tools that are sort of intended for manual use do not have the appropriate export formats like JSON or XML or YAML. But pick the tools that support exporting data and make sure that they support tagging that data with your resource identifiers and your AWS tags, et cetera, since you're going to be correlating a lot of that data from a lot of places. Further left in the pipeline, you want to pick, as I said before, you want to pick tools that are false positive, low false positive, so that developers don't really waste their time chasing ghosts too much. And further right in the pipeline, you want to choose tools that are lower false negative or high coverage. and be prepared to triage the results in parallel with the release so that you're aware of anything that might have made it to production without getting caught by any of the earlier steps. Moving faster usually means security issues escape into production a little bit more. But with diligence and security coverage over the entire pipeline, you can reduce this. So to ensure that issues that do escape are caught the next time, issues that should be broken down so that that tools can be modified and new rules written so that you can check specifically for application-specific issues and areas of focus earlier in the pipeline. So you really want tools that let you modify and write new rules. This is going to help you, ensure that things don't escape that that you could catch a little earlier on. So really, improving your process over time for DevSecOps means reducing security fix time. As things, move closer and closer to being found, left in the pipeline, you can probably fix things a lot quicker if they're found in development. But many times, a lot of your scans are going to run in parallel in the CI/CD cycle. So anything that takes time or extra time in that CI/CD cycle, which is usually like maybe 30 or 40 minutes, maybe an hour, or if you're adding a security scan that takes another hour on top of that, that's not good. So you have to pick things that make sense for the CI/CD cycle. And if there's a pull request involved, making sure that security scans are done quickly. For the pull request process as well. So these things also need to be accurate. So it's a challenge to find tools that can do things quickly and be accurate. Basically, if it's not fast or accurate, it needs to be triaged or pushed right and made parallel release cycle. So beyond finding issues quickly, the user experience around explaining why a problem is a real problem and how it needs to be fixed to be crystal clear. A 10-minute problem can take hours to fix if a developer needs to chase down the root cause of an issue because the report wasn't clear. That's kind of where the hidden cost is. Less the time spent by the tool to find the issue, but more the time the developer takes to interpret those results. So when security issues are reported, you need to ensure that the information to determine root cause is sufficient. Because having developers chase down why an issue is an issue is probably even more of an issue than how long the tools take. So continuous integration and continuous deployment also means continuous feedback or continuous improvement of process. So make sure that the outputs of one process are actually also useful input to refine other processes. For example, don't just find vulnerabilities, but help prevent them in the future. Your goal is to write high signal rules for your scanning tools, or add alarms at specific points when SLA is in danger of not being met, or when, for example, individual specific or high customers might be having a bad experience. Another thing you can do is to ensure that developers are kept in the loop. Their shared responsibility of security and operations means that developers could and probably should be taking a share of the operations workload. They might resist this, but you need to keep those ivory towers down. Get developers to work on operations tickets and to participate in support calls and to deal with security incidents. Maybe only take 5% of their time, but give them enough so that they keep it real and to keep in touch with the product. It could also be rewarding for developers if done well, because they get to see the customers actually appreciating their work. That increases their engagement. So at the end, it really comes down to building a culture of security. You pay attention to the culture. As you redefine your process, you need to get everyone's buy-in on quality. Everyone should be demanding that tests pass. Everyone's voice needs to be heard. Even inexperienced developers who might have they might actually have a lot more time to play with new tools and learn about them. And you'd be surprised what they can tell you. Another good tip is to not just do security trainings with your company. How often, we have like a generic slideware security training, but we don't often see enough specific security tool trainings that teach people how to use the security tools and get the most value from them. If your goal isn't just to check a box, it should be to make security an enabler. That means people need to learn how to use tools, so you should train them on them. And find a way to make things positive. Security is often viewed in a negative light, or there's a bunch of people in an ivory tower saying no to everything. Have your developers talk to customers and get their honest feedback, and they'll definitely value security more if they have to face the customer. If possible, choose tools that give you positive feedback as well. I know it's hard to find tools that tell you what you're doing right as well as doing wrong, but they do exist. Just to pitch Veracode Greenlight, it's one of those tools that does that. You might want to check that out. Make sure you reward good behavior internally. Security practices are often viewed as a requirement, but they don't get rewarded like they should be. So call people out for doing things correctly. Just to recap real quick, there's my thoughts on DevSecOps. Just know what kind of problem you're trying to solve. Define your DevSecOps roles clearly. Hire and build an SRE team if you can. Make it a specific person's specific jobs, specific roles problem, and then measure everything. Use the right tools in those measurements. Work to reduce the fix time for security issues. Make sure that one process can feed into another process continuously and improve over time, and embrace and love a culture of security in your company. That's all I've got to say on this. But I'll turn the presentation over to Vinod now from Wipro, so that he can give you to talk to you about a case study in DevSecOps implementation. And I would be glad definitely to take some questions at the end of the webinar. And thank you very much. So here's Vinod. I'll forward over to him. Okay, you're on, Vinod.
Thank you, Christian. For the next few minutes, I'll talk about Wipro, where a good collaboration that helped a large financial group in the journey of their DevSecOps. So Wipro was an incumbent providing application security services to this bank. And the bank has actually introduced DevOps into various business units and looking for integrating security within their DevOps stack itself. So the idea was to detect the vulnerabilities early through the SaaS analysis, so the remediation can be implemented far earlier than the traditional efforts. In order to scale for DevOps, the alignment of people, process, and technology is mandatory. Hence, Wipro proposed to review the security testing standards and their defining and thereby defining minimum security requirements for an applications within the DevSecOps itself. And also, the scope was to implement and evangelize DevSecOps adoption within the bank. So a well-defined enterprise vision sets the right tone for the DevSecOps engagement itself. What that means is you need an end-to-end thinking. What that means is from the inception of the security requirements until the rollout to production, and thereon from there on we have the application maintenance is kicking on. And how do we integrate security within the through the entire life cycle is a big question. So that's where the end-to-end thinking comes into picture, and looking at the process harmonization between the teams, and also identify the collaboration touch points that would actually help to establish a well-defined vulnerability management system, so that and we have key the roles and responsibilities are defined well, and everybody within the team or through the collaboration touch points understands their roles and responsibilities, and the time taken to fix or probably introduce or integrate the security within their DevOps stack itself is fairly very important. And also to ensure the tools that are actually used within the stack are appropriate, and that actually helps to step up the DevSecOps process itself. And then finally coming out with the people competency that enable to demonstrate the DevSecOps itself. So in a nutshell, the collaboration of people and convergence of processes help prioritize the remediation of the vulnerabilities itself. So our roadmap towards implementing the DevSecOps was in three folds, because we believe it has to actually overcome the resistance to change, allow the lessons learned in early phases, and ensure there is a solid foundation is available for adoption itself. So hence it was threefold. The first step was crawl, so where it was a greenfield implementation, so where it actually involved to define those DevSecOps processes itself, and setting up of environment, in the sense identifying of the right tools where it does not actually waste any of those developers' time to look out for false positives. And also it should be a seamless integration with the development tool set and the overall SaaS analysis itself. So what we did was we initially integrated with 5 applications, and the choice of tool here was Veracode for us. And once we had clear exit criteria for each of these phases, so the second phase was to onboard the additional applications. There were close to 85 applications that we had actually onboarded, so that to demonstrate the process is actually working. And what happened was the output was the consistency was there in terms of the output and the deliverables. So, and then so on and so forth. So we actually moved on to the next phase, which was run. So where we started onboarding more and more applications, and also was able to move into the several other business units, thereby establishing a vulnerability management framework. So that actually helped to upkeep with the abreast of the vulnerabilities within the bank itself. So, and the reference framework that we actually established within the bank was continuously driving the adoption of common operating procedures in terms of the execution methodologies, tools, and the knowledge management practices itself. So how it was done was we had performed in normative threat modeling that enabled to identify the criticality of an application, and thereby which was a key input for a service catalog. So a service catalog would contain the list of a variety of security testing activities that has to be performed, and it was socialized to a project manager, so who was in turn would allocate some budget in terms of which helped in chargeability, and also the security activities got into the project plan itself. So as and when the project moved on to the service delivery, so the project manager ensured the security items are included within the project plan, and thereby involving the security folks at the right time for the integration and the performance of any of those security testing activities itself. So the output of the security testing activities was tracked through a GRC portal in this particular bank scenario. So that helped them to track the vulnerabilities for a particular business unit, or it helped them doing a trending of vulnerabilities within the organization, so that that help them to take some corrective actions in terms of instructor-led trainings or any of reiterating of the coding guidelines itself. So, in order to evangelize the DevSecOps process itself, so we had split the team into two. So one we called as an onboarding team, and other one is the platform support team. So where the onboarding team were very closely working with the application teams to evangelize identify the requirement for integrating the SaaS tool, and the processes and methodologies were explained to them, so that to facilitate a clear maker and checker model itself, where the development team were making the software and also checking for the initial security part, and the security team was purely validating the inputs that were actually done by the application team itself. So, and the platform support team was where the specialist and overseeing the integration and fine-tune the performance itself. And a typical illustration of a DevSecOps was where we had the dev teams who had the source code ID plugins. So here in terms we were actually leveraging a green light that actually which was embedded into their Eclipse or the Microsoft Visual Studio IDE itself. So this helps to identify the security flaws as they are introduced into the code itself. And when the developer checks in the code into the version control system, could be Git or SVN, and then the build service pulls the code from the repository, and the build runs with the unit test runs as well. On successful build, the static code analysis is triggered, where we were leveraging the cyberattacks tool. So wherein the code was uploaded and the results were published, and the results were the results were triaged by the security analysts, and thereby we had an integration with the bug tracking system and also with the GRC tool. So the GRC tool, as I said earlier, was leveraged for trending analysis, and then looking at to take some corrective actions. And finally, we had the bug tracking system, which was actually Jira, so where we were able to integrate the results of the static analysis itself. And here we had a choice of passing the build or failing the build based on the output of the static analysis results. If there were any of critical or high vulnerabilities, the decision was to generally fail the build. And the minimum passing criteria for any of those applications is to have 0 critical and high defects, and wherein the medium defects, we had a remediation plan in order to fix them itself. And so the outcome was for this particular engagement was the probability of identifying a critical or high vulnerability was considerably reduced, and the vulnerabilities were actually tracked to closure. And we had a good standardized processes that actually helped in adoption and promoting transparency as well, because until a few years back, security has always been a black box. So now with the process of DevSecOps, it is we've been able to provide the particular transparency. And there were a lot of automations that actually automation that helped in ability to scale and also optimize the cost. For example, if there were 100 applications and the cost was X, and if the scale went to 200 applications, it was not 2X at all. And there were a lot of places where we have literally failed by evangelizing just the source code guidelines and providing the awareness. The culture did not actually change. Rather, when the DevSecOps is a fantastic part, like where the developers and the associated key stakeholders understands the importance of security, and therefore almost like are able to adopt for the security itself, and thereby driving the cultural change within the organization. Right, and that's where I am. So.
Guys,
So, Christian, so okay, can I pass to you? Sure.
Okay, looks like we had a little audio issue, perhaps. Gentlemen, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Chris Free.
Okay, well, that's the internet for you guys, right? The good news is I think if we can, Christian, if you could load up your screen again.
Sure.
Perhaps we can jump into questions, or did you have more to present?
I'm good. I can answer some questions if people want. If you could pass me the presenter ball, I can.
Okay, we'll
go ahead
get
and do that.
We'll get you the ball over. It sounds like we might have Vinod back. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, let's jump into some questions. We already have some from the audience. Of course, you're free to write in more, folks. One of the first ones is from Narendra, and he wants to know what are the examples of high false positive tools? What are some of the tools that are recommended? Christian, this was early on in your
presentation. Sure. Well, there's a lot of open source tools out there that people are tempted to throw into CI/CD pipelines because they're free, and many CI/CD pipelines like GitLab, for example, already come with a bunch of tools for some security analysis. You'll find that static analysis systems tend to be higher false positive, and that dynamic analysis systems tend to be higher false negative. So it's always a trade-off between false positives and false negatives, though, at Veracode, we make it our business to, attack false positives and false negatives and to reduce them as much as possible. So you're going to find that further right in your DevOps pipeline is probably a better spot to place the static analysis tools, and further left in the pipeline, more likely to place your dynamic analysis tools. Dynamic analysis really requires good coverage to be effective, but since many times developers are only going to care about the code that they just changed or the code that they're responsible for, you can usually take a dynamic analysis and throttle it back to only the parts that people care about. Whereas static analysis is typically, the whole program all at once. And as a result, would be considered a higher false positive. I'm not going to name specific names of tools. Veracode has a lot of competitors in the static analysis space, and we do our best to have world-leading FP rates, and I could always recommend our stuff to you, but in general, the class of static analysis tools is usually a little further right, and the things that are more dynamic analysis are further left. That said, there's good applicability. I mentioned the Greenlight tool from Veracode as well. That is aimed toward developers and aims toward using static analysis technology to provide a more focused analysis experience right there in the IDE for people. So if you haven't seen that before, you might want to ask us to give you a demo of that. That
sure.
Could help you with your pipeline. Yeah.
Christian, just to be clear, I have a long history in security myself, and I don't think anyone is going to sit up here and say that open source security tools are bad necessarily.
Not necessarily, no.
when you look at the total cost of ownership for some of these open source tools, some of that cost, well, you're not paying anything for the tool itself, but
Right.
in tuning them and using them and filtering out the noise to signal ratio, that's where it winds up costing you money. And sometimes it can be when you look dollar for dollar, what you're paying and what you get, the total
Right.
cost, as I said, is where it comes in there. But there are plenty of good open source security tools out there.
Absolutely, and many of them are linked off of like the OWASP webpage. The things like OWASP Zap proxy are very common these days in CI/CD pipelines. They have a Docker image that you can just spin up, and it provides the proxy pre-configured to do a baseline scan. Now, mind you, the baseline scan, and to Alan's point, is literally just crawling your website and trying a few things. It takes about 10 minutes and is not an extremely thorough scan of your app. It also can't do things like traverse authentication. If you have two-factor auth or even simple authentication, the open source tools like Zap, which are great if you're willing to spend the time setting them up. Out of the box, they're not going to provide you the ability to have the kind of coverage on your application that you'll need to feel comfortable. It'll let you check the box of security and say you're doing something, but it's not necessarily true that you're doing what you need to be doing. Open source tools, you often require a lot more hand-holding and a lot more configuration before they become truly useful.
Yep. Let's jump to another question from Sulaba. Christian, you mentioned cultural problems.
Yes.
And what's the? I can jump in here too, but I'm going to go first. It's your webinar. What kind of cultural problems are you alluding to?
Well, generally, when security is placed in an adversarial position to developers, which they typically have been in the past, developers are, often viewed as writing bugs, and security people as finding them and sending them, kicking their commits back to them or slapping their wrists for pushing something that had issues. That can build an adversarial relationship, and for companies that are trying to achieve DevSecOps, that doesn't exactly promote a sense of camaraderie between security people who are often in their tower saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. If you want to get developers feeling like security is going to enable them to move faster, they can't always be seen as just the guys who say no all the time. That's a cultural issue that expands just even beyond work. The people that are gravitate towards security are going to be the more contrarian people that you'll know, the ones that are actually actively have the personality type to find flaws in things. We need to make sure that we're finding flaws together in our software and not in each other.
That's a good way of putting it.
That's the best I can offer you on that one.
Yep. And I would just chime in that when you have been treated as another for most of your career, if you're a security guy, and then all of a sudden, someone puts their arm around your shoulder and says, "Come on, fella, you're part of the team."
Right.
You may not. It's only human nature. But by the same token, when someone does extend a hand to, bring you into the team, it's kind of incumbent on you to want to do that. So it goes both ways, right? It's not any one team's fault. It goes to the heart of what we talk about in DevOps, right? And that's why we call it DevSecOps.
Right.
It's about empathy and bringing that in. So
it's a shared fate. No longer will you have just a security team who's never at fault. And it's always the developer's fault. That's not going to be the case anymore. Ops is not going to be the only one wearing the pager and getting woken up at 4 a.m. when something goes wrong. To have that shared responsibility means, reducing the pain on everybody if done correctly.
Yep. And security is everyone's responsibility. So let's jump. We have another question here from Narendra.
Okay.
How big was the code base and how much time did it take to scan and notify vulnerabilities?
And that's a question for Vinod. Is Vinod on?
I don't know.
This question, yeah.
Yes.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay.
Do you hear me well? So you see, they were like the code bases were up to 50K to 75K, so and even less than that. So what we had done is they were out of 100 applications, possibly the complexity was 30, where 30% was small, which was less than 20 kilo lines of code, and 40 to 50% was ranging from 30 to 75 kilo lines of code. So for small and medium, the turnaround time was fairly very quick. In the sense it was for a medium it was less than an hour, and for the small ones it was in minutes, 25 to 35 minutes was that. And when it actually went beyond the 75 kilo lines of code, so that's where it was taking a little bit more time for us. Generally, it is a few hours, and that's where we have a decision. It should be a synchronous call or asynchronous call. That's where that's where the synchronous actually decide based on the time taken and the size itself.
Yep. Good answer. Tom Bell asked, not to focus too much on tools versus process, but you mentioned Hygia as a good dashboard to visualize the health of our CI pipeline. We'd like to investigate, other popular options. Are there other dashboards that are commonly used in the industry? And again, I don't think we want to specifically endorse specific tools, but I'll put it to both of you gentlemen. Are there other similar to Hygia, other contenders that Tom and his team can look at?
Yes. Am I on? Yes, I am. Okay.
Yes.
Well, if it depends on how much you want to roll your own. There's a lot of different stacks out there. The sort of Elasticsearch to Kibana stack is pretty common, especially for cloud applications. Graphite and Grafana. There's a great DevOps SecOps list of resources that has all kinds of different dashboards and things you can plug into them. If you Google for awesome DevSecOps, you can find a GitHub repo under github.com/devsecops/awesome DevSecOps, and that is a great sort of giant list of community dashboards, automation, bug hunting, testing, alerting, all of those different things you can plug in. They recommend things like Kibana and Grafana. Many of these things are designed for you to build your own dashboards. The Hygia one is probably the only one that I know of that does most of the work for you. But if you're willing to roll your own, there's a lot of things you can plug in. And you can see, if you go to that page, you'll see all these tools, like the node security platform stuff, Snake, Verico to plug in here, Brakeman, OWASP Zap, the Zap proxy, all that stuff I mentioned before. And there's just going to go through that list and see what makes sense for your organization.
Yep. Excellent. Well, we got another one here, and we got a few more. I'm sorry, guys. Is there any open source which can be used for DevSecOps? Steve Olela asked, and yeah, there's a ton of open,
Yeah, again, this is the awesome DevSecOps page. Most of it's open source stuff linked off of GitHub. So I would go through that, and you'll see, a lot of the OWASP and node security project stuff. That's all open source. I would definitely, dig on that.
Yeah. Hey, so I'm a terrible speller, but Christian, someone says, can we spell Hygia again, please?
Yeah, sure.
I'm not even going to try.
It's Hygiea. It's a Greek word.
Got it.
It's got a lot of.
Alrighty. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left here. We got a few more questions, but if you put them in, folks, we'll try to get to them. For continuous feedback, you mentioned that teams should assign a small percentage of operations workload to developers themselves.
Yeah.
Are there any other tools or processes that would complement this, that keeps developers in their, development environment?
Well, by nature, some of these, the goal here is to involve them in sort of real-time behavior. That said, anytime you are doing like a readout call with a customer or talking about, with support, via support, you know, be respectful of developers' time when you set that up. Use your scheduling systems and your ticketing systems. I wouldn't say that there's specific tools other than maybe the ones you're already using that the developers are already using. They expect to get bug tickets and things like that in Jira or whatever. I would make sure that they continue to get their to-do items through the same means. Don't just call them on the phone. They're probably not the type of people that want to get a phone call all of a sudden. But if you could, make sure that they know what to expect, and that there's going to be once a week they get on the phone with a customer to talk about their experience. That will help them stay in the loop with what people are really experiencing on the ground, and to get a context for hearing the customer's feedback directly from the customer unfiltered, and that generally leads to intellectual honesty when it comes to not having developers breathing their own fumes too much.
Great. All right. Another question. Well, just thank you there. So which open source, a lot of open source questions. Which
Sure.
open source dashboards do you recommend to show DevSecOps adoption?
To show adoption or just to do adoption?
I think for adoption, and maybe it was just
Yeah.
Right
I think so. Again, for me, I'm a bit of a developer. It's what I do. I wrote a lot of the core Veracode static analysis engine. So it's my interest is in things like Kibana and Elasticsearch, mostly because that's been shown to scale really well. Rather than having, for me, having a more monolithic dashboard is less interesting. I want things that I can be done in piecemeal. So a lot of data collection, and then you can have that data backed up and stored, and then have something to interpret that data. I like rolling my own stuff. So the elk stack is where I would go first. But again, the dashboard itself could just be a very basic, set of HTML graphs or something. It does not need to be, the most slick interactive thing, as long as it's presenting the right information and, sliced and diced the right way. I think, the value of the information itself, less about its presentation. So, I mean, there's a temptation to go for really slick looking dashboards and to focus on look and feel, just because, it's kind of neat. And if you're going to be looking at it all the time, it's nice to have it look nice. But, focus more on what data to collect and what tools to use to collect that data. And then worry a little bit later about, whether you're using a React.js, really slick dashboard. Focus on data collection and correlation of that data first.
Yep.
And then having a static dashboard is fine, but it's actually more important to also have automated alerts. Eliminate polling. Polling is the act of going in and having somebody every half an hour look at the dashboard. It would be better if the dashboard was interrupt driven and actually sent out alerts warning you when certain conditions were met. So even if you didn't have graphs to look at, and even if you didn't have a dashboard to look at, if you have a system that warns you when bad things are happening or when attention is needed, then you can act appropriately when you need to. So again, collect your data and find ways to automate alerting and reporting on that data.
Fair enough. Guys, we actually, one last question here. We have a minute, so Christian, quickly.
Yep.
Question about Veracode for Change. We've integrated VSTS for code scan on a CI build.
Yes.
Is there a way to bring back the logs to VSTS reports rather than having users go to Veracode portal to look at results?
Absolutely. Veracode is one of those tools that is completely API driven, and there are a number of Veracode API sort of plugins. The Visual Studio team services, you might want to talk to your service your Veracode service engineers about VSTS integration. We have API integration for VSTS, amongst other things. So again, if you wanted to roll your own, there's a whole documented API as well that you can use to access Veracode and any information in it to integrate into your dashboards.
Great. Guys, that brings us right up to the top of the hour. What a great webinar here today on DevSecOps. Christian, Vinod, both of you, thank you. Great. I think, the audience says thank you too, because all the questions come up with a thank you afterwards. So guys, good job. Thank you very much to both YPro and Veracode, and to Veracode for sponsoring today. We'll call it a day, though, because we're at the top of the hour. We do respect your time. This is Alan Schimmel for Security Boulevard. Thanks for sitting in on another webinar, and we will speak to you soon on another webinar, we hope. Bye-bye, everyone.